This is one of the episodes where I really have very little idea about what I'm going to say, but regardless, I don't know, it feels pretty important to me to record this episode. And I'll tell you why. So, about a month ago, a friend of mine, Michelle Sampson, who I worked with for probably a year and a half or so, was killed in a car crash in Tennessee in a head on collision. And she left behind a husband and two kids and family, and judging by her memorial service, many people who cared deeply about her. And she was just such a highly accomplished professional and an amazing human being. I used to sit down in her office for hours. Well, probably not for hours in a row, but like over the course of our relationship for hours and hours and hours, commiserating about the place we worked and all that kind of stuff, and talking about life, and just really felt like I had the relationship I had with her was important to me. And so her loss has been, I mean, I can't, I guess I can kind of imagine what her family's going through, but, obviously not really, right? And so I wanted to make this podcast because I wanted to talk about grief. And I think the reason I want to do it is because I've been trying to think of how I could make some type of small contribution to Michelle's family and her memory, and also make a contribution to anybody else who's going through loss, right? Because for me, my experience with grief was one of really a lack of understanding at the beginning, and for the first quite a while, I guess. But then this progressively more interesting series of insights that I've had as I've grown as a human being, and I've talked to people about it, and I've let myself feel the feelings. And so I'm certainly no expert on grief other than to say I've been through it, but I've learned a lot from it. So I wanted to talk about that experience because, like I said, I feel like I want to do something to make some kind of contribution out of the loss of Michelle, maybe to her family, but maybe to other people too. So I guess here goes. And I don't even know if this is going to end up making sense at the end, but it feels important to me to say it. And that's really all that matters. And I've learned that if something feels important to say it, I should typically probably say it and not really worry about how polished it comes across as sounding, because if I was to worry about that too much, I would never get anything done. I would never say anything probably. So here goes. So to Michelle's family, I would say that, I talked to you briefly at the memorial service. I'm sure you don't remember because there was hundreds and hundreds of people there, which again, I think was just a beautiful testament to how much Michelle meant to the world, but also just that experience. Well, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, but we talked briefly at our memorial service, I'll just say, and I'm sure you don't remember, but I remember, and I feel for you so much, and it just, it feels really important to do this. So I hope that you find it a contribution, and maybe if you don't find it to be a contribution, at least know that somebody felt like it was important to do something at least know that I felt like it was important to do this, both I think for me and for Michelle and maybe for you. So here we go. So grief for me was a really interesting experience because I didn't know what it was. So in my case, most people who listen to this podcast know, but I'll just very briefly talk about my story because it is obviously very different than Michelle's, but I think some of the emotions are quite similar. So, I mean, my first wife was diagnosed with a mental health issue, very traumatic, and spent 6 years in really a living hell and causing a lot of chaos. And ultimately, she took her own life in 2010. And so for me, there was a bunch of different stages or kinds of grief along the way. The first one I went through was, I think it's called ambiguous grief. And that was where I looked at my wife and I lost something. Well, actually, you know what? Let me back up and define what grief is. So it's a normal, natural emotional reaction to loss or change of any kind. of itself, grief is neither a pathological condition and nor is it a personality disorder. I think this is something that I struggled with, which I'll talk about in a bit, because I actually thought grief was I didn't give it a whole lot of thought, actually, but when I did think about it, I thought it was weakness. I didn't understand the critical role that it played in healing and providing context. So back to the story. The first type of grief I experienced was ambiguous grief, which I think is like the result of me looking at my wife, who looked the same and sounded the same, but was not even remotely close to the same person that I had fallen in love with. And that was a really hard thing to wrap my head around, because she would say and do things that were so out of character for her and so hurtful, and it caused me so much pain, and other people so much pain too, as a result of her mental illness, that I really grieved the loss of this woman, the mother of my kids, especially when I realized that I didn't really think I was ever going to get her back. That was super, super painful for me. And I didn't understand that it was grief at the time. It was just a lot of sadness and a lot of anger and feeling ripped off and all of those kind of things. And I think too, like, there was different moments of I think different stages when I realized that. Like, for example, when we went to the psychiatrist and they were trying all these medications and none of them worked and she was getting worse. I remember having a moment where I walked out of the psychiatrist's office, and I don't remember what it was he had said, but it was something to the effect like, I'm not sure how much else there is that we can do, or something like that. Like, how many other things there are to try. And I remember walking out of there thinking, our lives are never, ever going to be the same after this. Like, I had, until that point, I had kind of, I think, harbored this idea that, ultimately we were just one medication away from everything being sorted out or whatever. And realizing that, oh my God, things are never going to be the same. We're never going to get our life back. And in like my mid-30s, this is what we have to look forward to for the rest of our lives, was so devastating. And so grieving the loss of our life that had been planned out and, was structured in the way that we wanted, and we had a great future to look forward to. I did grieve that loss, but I didn't let myself do that, of course. But that was a moment that caused me, that I needed to grieve, I guess I'll just put it that way. And then also back to seeing my wife changing, that was very, very devastating. And again, thinking it was never going to be the same. I remember taking her to the psychiatric institution, to a psychiatric institution for her own protection. She was suicidal. And I remember the metal door closing in the locked ward. And I remember walking out of the hospital and, God, grieving. I don't know what I was grieving there exactly. Just so much sadness and confusion, and wondering if she was ever even going to come out of there. Like, honestly, I had no idea if she was going to come out of there. I remember driving home just feeling the most empty, lonely feeling. One of the lowest feelings I've ever felt. So there's a lot of things. The point of me telling you that is that there's a lot of things that I needed to grieve along the way that I didn't realize. And none of this really applies to Michelle, I'm sure. But in my case, it was setting myself up for a way of thinking about pain and loss and change that didn't really serve me well at all. Because in that instance, I mean, I had these very clearly defined views of what it meant to be strong. But I also had a lot of things that needed to be done, right? Like, I had kids I had to keep raising. I had my wife I was trying to keep alive, and had to work and try to sort this all out, and all this thoughts going on in my head and blah, blah, blah. So I didn't really have time to sit back and reflect and, think about what was happening too much. I mean, I guess I did, but not in like a sort of analytical way. It was just more being wrapped up in this maelstrom. Is that the right way to say that? Maelstrom, I think, and trying to keep my head above water. So then, what can happen with mental health issues is, and especially in severe, like Cindy's case, she ended up taking her own life. And I remember being really relieved in some ways, because her pain was over. I thought my pain was over, and I don't know. I just thought it was a chance to protect my kids, from a lifetime of chaos and build a new life. So I didn't really grieve her death. I didn't really think that I had to grieve her death. And in some ways, as sick as this sounds, there are some things I felt happy about. But I did feel a lot of sadness. Like, I'm not going to lie to you, obviously. Like, I remember going over to her house after she died, and it's just such a weird snapshot in time because she had filled the bath up, and she had music. There was still music playing, and like, it was like time had stood still in some ways. And, she wasn't, the interesting thing about that was, like, she wasn't on Facebook or anything. And I think about now, or like really any kind of social media, and I think about now, and I think about like Michelle, for example, and it's got to be so unbelievable that her life in some ways is frozen in time, because all of a sudden she was very active on social media, and this huge social media presence, and it's like it takes some snapshot and just ends. And I don't know what you do with that as a family. I don't know if it's a source of comfort or if it's a source of misery or if it's both. It's probably both depending on the various times because there's so many happy memories on there as well. But I didn't really have that with Cindy. But I guess my point is when I went to her house, it was a very similar idea of, it's like everything just came to an end. That was really hard. I'm getting quite emotional just thinking about that moment. I remember lying on the bed and just sobbing, but not knowing that it was grief that I was feeling. So I didn't know that. And I was drinking very heavily at the time because I was having all these feelings of pain and loss and all that kind of stuff. But I didn't know how to process them. And I really just wanted them to go away. And so during her illness and after, I turned to alcohol just to cope with the feelings. Although, again, I'm saying all this afterwards with the benefit of a lot of hindsight and reflection and healing, because I didn't understand anything that was happening at the time. I just thought I was a drinker and, just kept doing that. So I really moved past her death quite quickly. I had a few very emotional moments over the first few years, like, because I got together, had gotten together with somebody else. We ended up remarrying in 2012, and I don't know, it seemed like my life had moved on. And I remember there being a few moments that probably should have told me that I needed to do some healing, aside from all the drinking and all that. I mean, sure, I wasn't even thinking about that as a problem that had anything to do with the experience I had been through. I was trying really hard not to even think of it as a problem. But I remember about 1 year after Cindy's death, my new girlfriend, so at Cindy's funeral, her family, who she wasn't close with, and I don't know, I don't want to even get into it. It doesn't really matter, but they got her headstone created because I really was not in a headspace to be able to take care of that. I don't know how people take care of that. Anyways, blah, blah, blah. They took care of her tombstone and they spelled Chloe, our oldest daughter's name, wrong. And I remember thinking, God, that was such a kick in the gut. Like, just, God, but I just didn't have the cycles to deal with it. And I remember when I left a funeral home, my kids were too young to even understand it at the time. And when I left the cemetery, I was like, I don't even think I ever want to come back to this place. But anyways, on my birthday the next year, my girlfriend at the time and my wife now, she spent her own money and got Cindy's headstone redesigned and like replaced with Chloe's name spelled right. And the reaction I had to that unbelievable amount of kindness and compassion, I sobbed, oh my God, like a lot. I just completely broke down. And that probably should have told me that, I hadn't really healed from that experience, but it really didn't. It was just, I took it for what it was an incredible act of kindness. But the thing is I kept drinking. And I think one thing that's really important is that at this phase of my life, I was really a victim masquerading as a hero. So what I mean by that is that what's the best way to put this? Like I was looking back, I was very eager to tell people my story so they understood how hard what I had been through was, but also how heroic I was, right? Like how strong I was, and I raised my kids through all that, and blah, blah, blah. And I stood by my wife, and yada, yada, yada. And that version was important to me. And why I'm saying this part is because it really held me back, because I was so busy clinging on to this story I was telling myself about the past, and using it to rationalize my own behavior, right? Which was drinking. And, basically what I was saying was, God, if you've been through what I've been through, you drink too. So leave me alone, because drinking sort of is what helped me be this heroic, right? So, and that went on for 4 years after Cindy's death. And it got to a point where for most of I think all the time, I was drinking pretty much every single day, and not a little bit. Like, God, if I had a buck for every time I stopped at the liquor store over the course of those years, I'd have a very different financial situation. Let's put it that way. So, and then what happened for me was 4 years later, I stopped drinking, and it was like nothing really changed at the beginning. But it was probably 8 months after I stopped drinking that I started to feel a lot of different feelings that I hadn't felt before. And those feelings were like, one of them was sadness. One of them just, I had a lot of moments where Cindy would be in my dreams, and one of the things that would happen to me was that she would appear in my dreams, and most of the time it was not a happy memory. She would appear in my dream, and she would be there and in some way screw up the life I had now. So whatever that looked like. So come and try to take the kids away or whatever. And it was really, the dreams were very terrifying, but they were also exceptionally vivid, but they also caused me to feel guilty. Even though knowing I have no control over my dreams, really, I just felt guilty for, even in my subconscious while I was sleeping, like having all these negative thoughts about her. So, and then, as I said, I started to feel sadness, and I started to spend more time reflecting on our lives. And like, I don't think the sadness was, because this was coming up on 5 years after her death, and I don't think the sadness was like super profound or deep, or like I couldn't get out of bed or anything, but it was really starting to spend more time thinking about our time together. And slowly, in some ways, starting to remember a little bit more of the happier times, instead of always thinking about how terrible the last 6 years of her life was. And then I found myself I had started writing, like blogging. And the reason I started blogging was mostly about stopping drinking, actually. So I didn't, at this point, I didn't understand really much of what was happening at all, or what it meant. I just knew that, wow, oh my God, I had managed to stop drinking, and so I'm going to start writing about it. And then as I was writing blogs and stuff like that, I started wanting to write about Cindy. And so I did that, and I didn't really know why I felt like writing about it. All of a sudden, I think I more started feeling like it was an important story to tell, especially around the mental health issues and all that. So I think I felt like I was providing some kind of service to people, and I definitely was. But I didn't understand that this was part of my grieving process. And I remember talking to my wife now saying, do you find this weird that I'm spending all this time thinking about Cindy and writing about her? And she said, as intuitive and brilliant as she is, she said, no, of course not. This is part of the process you need to go through to grieve. And that was the first time anybody had mentioned the word grief, or that I thought about what was happening to me in the context of grief. And having that word put to it gave me something to think about and read about and learn about. And that was really helpful for me, actually, just knowing that it was grief and that, whatever it was okay. And it was also that it was something that I needed to go through, even though it was 5 years later. And I'm going to release a podcast with an expert on grief in the near future. But she told me that for the clients that she deals with, many of them are like 10, 15, 20 years after the event or events that caused them to, grieve. That's when she sees them. So it's not something that you can run away from. It's something that you really need to deal with. And I started to do some things that were, they made perfect sense to me at the time. And it's not that they don't make sense to me now. It's that, I don't know, I feel like I'm losing the deep connection to those moments a few years later. But regardless, one of the things I did was, Cindy's buried about 100 kilometers from here. And I think it was July 3rd of 2015. My wife and kids were away. And I decided that I had been biking a lot, road biking, cycling. And I decided I was going to ride to her grave. Now so that was a 218 kilometer round trip. And it felt really, really important for me to do that because she had a really traumatic childhood with, a lot of mental health issues and abuse and abandonment. And she was kind of abandoned by her family a lot. And she felt like for a lot of her life, she was not worth fighting for. And so my thought process when I rode to her grave was, it was going to be painful. It was like in the middle of the summer. It was like 30 degrees Celsius, like 80 something Fahrenheit. I knew it was going to be painful. I knew it was going to be tough. But I also, in my mind, wanted her to see that she was worth suffering for. So I rode my bike there. And when I got there, it took me a few, like three and a half hours, I think, to ride there, something like that. And maybe 4, I think 3.5. And when I got there, I read a poem that a friend had given me, and it was just so appropriate. And I sobbed at her grave harder than I ever had since at any time since her death. And I was only there for 15 minutes, and I left. But I didn't know what I felt, other than emotionally drained and having to ride my bike for another 3.5 hours to get home. But it felt so important to me. And it was very cathartic for me, I think, in some ways. And so that was an important moment for me. And it's just funny because as I think about it now, it's nothing, it doesn't matter, but it's such a interesting thing to think about, that it felt so like, I think what I want to highlight is that it felt so important to me to do that, and not knowing why it felt so important at the time. Like, it doesn't matter. Sometimes we just got to go with what feels important to us. So I did that. And I want to talk about visiting her grave, because that is an experience that's different every time. I don't go that often, especially anymore, but what's interesting is that sometimes when I visit her grave, it's like this profoundly emotional experience. And other times when I visit her grave, it's like I feel like I'm talking to a rock. And sometimes that's hard to reconcile. Like, how come I felt such a deep connection this time and I don't feel one, and the next time I feel basically nothing, and trying to sort that through. And God, does that make me a bad person? Is there something wrong with me? Did I come here in the headspace, not in the right headspace or whatever? And I realize now there's no way to possibly predict what you're going to feel in a given moment when you show up there. But those are things that I had to come to terms with, right? Is feeling like there was supposed to be feeling like there was a way I was supposed to feel. And there's not. Of course there's not. I also remember in the summer of 2015, I had started meditating. And I remember very vividly one morning sitting on our back deck in the summertime and picturing a dot, like a dot of light, and then expanding the dot of light. It was a guided meditation. And in that moment, in that point of light, I felt her presence so strongly. Like it was very powerful. I physically felt the sensation of her presence in my body, whatever that means. I don't even know what that really means other than there was a physical sensation. And, I remember thinking at the time, what was that? And what I really came to terms with was it doesn't matter what it was. I felt her presence and I physically felt it. Whatever it was doesn't even matter. Like it could have been her spirit. It could have been just me completely making it all up in my own mind. Whatever. The point is that it was real to me and it was important to me. And so when you feel these feelings, don't judge them. There's no place for judgment. Just look at it for what it is, experience that moment and use it to, I don't know, just be present. Like for me, it brought me a great sense of peace. And peace is, more peace is something that most of us need. So there'll be many, many of these moments that maybe don't make sense or whatever, or fly in the face of what your beliefs are. Because when I felt her presence, up until that moment, I felt like that's not even a real thing. Very practical, logical, data-driven guy. Until I felt that moment. And that profoundly changed the way I look at the world, right? Because I know there's things we don't understand, but it really, I think how it impacted me was I realized that what's real doesn't have to be some physical thing in front of us. I felt her presence and it felt important to me in that moment, and that is enough. So to be able to cast aside the judgment of experiences that you feel that you may never have felt before is a really powerful way to heal, and a really powerful way to connect with the memory and also maybe the spirit of the person that you've lost who you love so much. So Michelle in this case. So I started to have these experiences, I guess, and it really started to change how I looked at the past. So I noticed myself as I stopped talking about, not that I stopped right away. I started to change the stories I was telling about the past to one where, like, I was rewriting the stories I was telling myself about the past, I guess is the best way to put it. And I was starting to look at it less like a dark time in my life and more like a really powerful crucible experience that led me to becoming the human being I am today. And I'm going to touch on that a little later because I think it's really important, because there's a lot of guilt that can come with these types of things, because I think in a lot of ways, there's some part of me anyways that felt like I was supposed to continue to feel bad. And in that the way that my level of feeling bad was a reflection of how much I was honoring her memory or something, which sounds crazy. But I think for anybody that's had some kind of loss, I'm sure you can relate to that. But so as time progressed, I started being more open about some of the things that had happened, some of the things I had done during her illness. And I say that because in that vulnerability and authenticity, not only did I learn more about myself, but I learned really a hell of a lot about a lot of other people that I never would have had the opportunity or reason to pursue if I hadn't had this experience. So I started hearing a lot about people's own stories and of loss and abuse, like substance abuse and all of these things. And I realized that, holy crap, this experience that happened to me can be the source of a huge contribution that I can make to the world. And that was very healing for me, right? To know that, I don't want to say like it happened for a reason. It's not that. It's more like maybe I made a reason, an honorable reason appear out of that tragedy. I don't really know. But my point is that it started to feel like I had an increased sense of purpose, and that sense of purpose was born out of my experiences, and starting to realize that maybe I did have some kind of higher calling or something. was very healing for me because, again, I found purpose, meaning in the pain. And I think being able to find meaning in the pain, which takes time, obviously, but it's really, really important. So, but also, as I progressed through these feelings, or through this phase of my journey, I started to feel less sad about the loss of Cindy. And sometimes I felt guilty about that. Like I said earlier, sometimes I really felt guilty about it. But overall, I felt like I was doing something more important from her loss. And so for me, that was important. And I want to say too, that whatever it means for me, like whatever my journey was and whatever felt important to me and whatever lessons I learned, they're unique to me. It's not that other people won't learn those lessons, but nobody will share my exact experience. However, there's so many similarities in our common experiences. And I think by talking about them, like by me talking about my story, you'll hear echoes of your own in mine for sure. Maybe not now, but maybe at some point in the future, and maybe it'll help. So then it's interesting what started to happen to me, because I started to find myself in these hypothetical situations that I couldn't really resolve, right? And then there's like guilt associated with it. So I'll give you an example. Like lately, because it's been 7 years and I've done a lot of healing, I've really helped a lot of people, I've really altered the trajectory of my life, and I have these thoughts sometimes, and they're impossible to reconcile, right? Because I look at it and I go, holy crap, so much goodness has come out of Cindy's death and my reaction to it. Like, I've made such a positive contribution to the world. Would I have made it if she was still alive? I don't know. And then I start thinking, God, was her death a net benefit to the world in some way? And then I feel tremendously guilty for thinking such a screwed up thought, but it's normal and it's a natural thing to wonder about. And I think judging those thoughts and shutting them down is a way to block the natural process of healing, because there are going to be all kinds of things that you don't know how to reconcile. For example, I look at my life now, and there's times I think, God, my wife is so amazing. My daughters have grown into these beautiful young women. I'm happy. And the depth of my love for my wife that I have now is like nothing I've ever felt before. But the only way any of it happened is through Cindy being dead. Not only through her being dead, but through her, the experience of her mental health issues, her death, and then my experience afterwards. And so one time, I remember sometime, not very long ago, somebody asked me, would you even want her to still be alive? Which is a really weird question to ask. But regardless, I think allowing myself to be in these to listen to these confusing questions and allow myself to be in the space to think about them is really important, because I had no idea how to answer that question, and I still don't. But it caused me to think about that in a way that I hadn't thought about it before. And for me, that type of thinking and allowing myself to be in those confusing spaces is really important. And, one of the things that I experienced along the way, let me back up a little bit, and I'll just say that one of the things that I experienced along the way was I started feeling a lot of emotions that I had never allowed myself to feel before. And that's one of the reasons that I hadn't allowed myself to grieve before. So like things like anxiety and, sadness, I'm going to call it depression, but, sadness and angst and all that kind of stuff. I never had let myself feel those emotions. But as I went through the grieving process, I realized that those emotions are a critical component of who I am. And by not allowing myself to feel them and masking them with alcohol or drugs or whatever, I was really not living the full human experience, not even close. And that, what's the best way to put it? I don't know. I guess I just realized that I'm a more complex person. And I also realized how important it is for me to feel those emotions and live the full human experience. And that's a gift that I got as a result of what I had been through and allowing myself to go through the grieving process. And I think another thing that I've learned is man, there are so many times when it sucks so bad, when it hurts so bad. And it's just so important to let yourself feel those feelings, to not judge them, to not put some artificial timeline on when they're supposed to end or the severity or intensity that you're supposed to feel them in. There's no manual for that. And it's I think, in allowing yourself to feel those feelings that you can come to terms with them and you can understand them and you can process them and you can slowly start to, I don't know if moving past them is the right way to put it, or more just, having some different insights to allow them to put them into the appropriate place in your life, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. So for me, it's like, yeah, you know what? The feelings of sadness and all that, they're diminished. They're greatly diminished, but they're always present in some way. And they will appear sometimes when I least expect it. And I'm going to tell you a little story about that in a second. But feeling them and living them is just super, super insightful. So if I can encourage you to allow yourself to do that and to talk openly about them and to not put a timeline on them is important, and to not dampen them with drugs or alcohol as much as possible. There might be times when it's just simply too freaking painful. I get that, and there's no judgment. God, my whole point of making this podcast and like this Mental Health Warriors podcast and this specific episode is to always tell people that, man, I struggle too. And if you ever want to talk to me, I won't judge you. So yeah, there will be times when you don't make, maybe the greatest choices in how you cope with the pain. But there's no one that can judge you for that. And don't judge yourself. Just understand it and learn from it. And, it's not linear. Like, it's just not a linear process. There's times you feel like you've made, quote, progress, whatever that means. And then there'll be times you feel like, you're at the bottom of a lake and you're drowning. And it's all part of it, right? It really is. So being able to know that those are normal feelings and know that it's okay to talk about them and it's okay to feel them is really, really important. And I wish I had learned that sooner. So if I can help this podcast, that's why I'm talking about it. So, but what's also interesting is how situations happen long after the fact. And I don't know if it ever stops. I really have no idea, because I only have my own experience up until this point. But when Michelle died, I mean, obviously her finding out about her death was really impactful for me. But what happened to me was really surprising. When I went to her memorial service that Friday night, I mean, obviously I was dreading it, just because of obviously what happened. But what I didn't expect was, as I drove the half an hour or so to the funeral home, I started to feel so anxious, like majorly, like almost anxiety attack anxious. And I didn't know why I was feeling that way. Like, I mean, obviously I knew it had something to do with Michelle, but I realized as I was driving, as I was thinking through it, this is the first time I had been into a funeral home since Cindy's death. And I remember what it was like to be on the other side of that incredibly surreal, bizarre experience of talking to all kinds of people about the person that you've lost and it being a blur, and how weird it was in your case, Michelle's ashes to be there, in Cindy's case, for her body to be lying there. And oh God. And so as I'm driving there, I'm thinking about you guys and remembering my own experience and just feeling super, super anxious and feeling like not knowing what to say, but feeling like I should say something. I mean, I've never met you, and trying to be sensitive to the experience that you're having and the loss that you've just suffered, and feeling like I wanted to make some kind of contribution, but not knowing how, and all that stuff. And it caused me a tremendous amount of anxiety. And so anyways, as I went there and, I met with some old friends that I hadn't spoken to in a while. And we went out afterwards to a place that Michelle used to like to go, Legends, with her coworkers and stuff. But as I was driving home that night, I felt so, I think the best way to put it was ungrounded. And I don't know how to describe it any other way, but when I went home, I got home probably around midnight and my wife was still awake and I was so worked up and like just feeling like I hadn't really, I don't remember feeling like this before, but like feeling like I couldn't, I don't know how to put it. I honestly don't know how to put it, but I'm talking to my wife about this and I'm like, I literally felt so ungrounded, whatever that means. I'm not even sure how to describe what that means, but I felt so ungrounded that when I was talking to her, I actually stood with my back and legs and the back of my head against a wall in our bedroom because it made me feel connected to something solid. And I found that really helpful. And it's not something I've ever done before. And it's not something I had ever experienced before, but I know that it was grief. It was grief for the loss of Michelle, and it was my own grief for the loss of Cindy. And it was just all of that, all mixed into one. And I think I just found it emotionally overwhelming. And as I'm laying in bed, I got into bed and I'm talking to Tanya, my beautiful, amazing wife. And I'm like, now I'm stressing myself out because I'm like, okay, I'm a coach, like a life coach, and I don't know what to do right now. I don't know if I should allow myself to be the witness of these thoughts and not let them affect me and blah, 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 or if I should just allow myself to be in this fucking space right now and just feel all these feelings and I don't know what to do. And I was actually starting to stress myself out about not knowing what choice to make. And I remember Tanya's telling me, just choose anything. You can never know if it's the right choice until after you make it. And I was like, yeah, you know what? Thank you. That's true. And so I just decided to allow myself to feel those feelings. And yeah, it was it was tough. I'll be totally honest with you. Actually, I got stoned when I smoked a joint when I came home, and it was just really, I was just feeling really overwhelmed, right? And that actually allowed me to talk about it in a way that was a little bit more open and non-judgmental of myself. So when I woke up the next morning, though, I felt like I had literally been run over by a truck. Like I was so wiped out. And it was because of everything, right? Like totally it was because of everything. And I just did not expect all of that to happen. And that's why I wanted to make this podcast, I guess, because, I guess one of the lessons that I've learned is that you never know. I don't know if grief ever ends. I don't know what it looks like what it will look like tomorrow. Most days I don't even think, like the vast majority of days, I don't really think about things in terms of grief, or I don't think about Cindy. It's been 7 years now. Our lives are very different. Like I said, I've remarried. I've had a number of different jobs since then. I mean, in a lot of ways, it almost seems like a different life. And one thing I'll say about my kids, though, is they were 5 and 6 when Cindy passed away, and their journey's been interesting. And I think just one thing to keep in mind, and this probably won't happen with Michelle's kids because they're a little older, but with what my kids felt was guilt. Like sadness, obviously, all those feelings, but later, a few years on, they felt guilt because they started to forget Cindy because they were so young and so much time had passed, and forgetting the smells and forgetting the feelings and forgetting what she looked like. And especially for my younger daughter, because Cindy was sick for a lot of her life and she doesn't really remember her at all. Which actually, now that I say that out loud, I think that made it easier for her. It's my older daughter. So she went through a period where she felt guilt, like the feelings that I'm feeling, I'm not supposed to feel because I'm supposed to be able to remember my mother. And so those are some things that might come up, but they handled it okay. But so anyways, I've been rambling on for a long time. I guess the main message I wanted to get across was grief is powerful. Grief is necessary. Grief is healing. Grief lets you understand the past and start to remember the joy from the past, it gives you a whole bunch of insights that if you choose to, you can use to serve other people, because so many people go through this type of loss and are not able to process it or not understand how important processing it is. And it's a tool that can really help bind people together, or it's an emotion that can help really bind people together. But I guess there's no right or wrong way to feel it. Just if I could offer you any encouragement, it's to talk openly about your feelings. It's to feel the pain, but it's also to on your own time, remember all the happy times. And that takes time, but it'll happen. And I guess I would just end this podcast by saying to you that I am so sorry for your loss. I miss Michelle, and I can't even imagine how much you miss Michelle. But she was an incredible human being. She was a good friend to me, and I valued the relationship that we had a lot. More so, it's funny. It's not funny, but I mean, it's interesting that I valued our relationship as much as I knew I valued it. With her being gone, I understand. I valued it even more than I thought, because it's impacted me in a way that I don't know. It's impacted me significantly, and just it's interesting. So this podcast, taking the time to record this podcast, I've tried to start this podcast a bunch of times, and I have not been able to find my voice. But this is grief. For me, this is the kind of thing that helps me process grief. And that's by using the feelings that I'm having and the experiences that I'm having to make a contribution, or be of service to other people. So I guess this is my way of grieving Michelle, but I guess what I wanted to say is her loss has made me really driven home how much the world can lose with the loss of a single human being. She touched so many lives. She was so incredibly competent as a professional. She was like on our team at work. She was a lot of times felt like the glue that held the place together. And believe me, you needed to be super glue to be able to hold that place together. So I wanted to thank you for giving the world Michelle. And just to say that I am here. And while I certainly can't understand your unique experience, what I can understand is the pain of great loss. And if you ever want to talk to me, I'm here, and you can reach out to me at any time. And I know I'm not alone. I know this sentiment I'm about to express is shared by so many people. But Michelle was an amazing human being. Her memory will live on in you and her amazing children, and I miss her.